My wife left a note, "Don't look for me. I need freedom." So I didn't. I filed for divorce, froze the accounts, and went on vacation. 5 days later, she was waiting outside my lawyer's office in tears. I, Austin Mitchell, 38. And the note was sitting on the polished granite of our kitchen island, weighted down by her house key. Not the front door key I noticed, but the specific one for the back door, the one she always used. A small, deliberate detail that somehow made everything worse. It was 4 sentences long, written in her neat, looping cursive that always looked so at odds with her personality. "I need to be on my own for a while. This isn't working for me anymore. I need freedom. Don't look for me. No, I'm sorry. No, I love you, but..." Just a clinical statement of departure, like a resignation letter from a job she'd grown tired of. For a moment, I did nothing. I just stood there in the silent kitchen, the scent of the coffee she'd made before she left, still hanging in the air like a ghost of normalcy. I looked around at the life we had built over 6 years of marriage, the custom tile backsplash we'd argued over for weeks. Me wanting something practical, her insisting on the expensive mosaic that caught the morning light just so, the ridiculously expensive Scandinavian armchair in the corner that was supposed to be her reading chair, though she mostly just threw her coat on it. The matching dining set we'd saved for months to afford, choosing it together on a Sunday afternoon that felt like a lifetime ago. It all felt like a stage set for a play that had just abruptly ended, the actors having walked off mid-scene without bothering to explain the plot. There was no screaming, no throwing things, no dramatic confrontation. The grief was there, a cold, heavy stone in my gut, settling deeper with each breath. But it was accompanied by something else. A strange, unnerving calm that I didn't recognize. For the first time in 6 years, I realized I didn't need permission to make a decision. I didn't need to check with anyone, negotiate with anyone, compromise with anyone. The realization was both liberating and terrifying. Rebecca had always been the impulsive one, the one prone to dramatic gestures and grand pronouncements. She was the storm. I was the lighthouse, steady and unmoving. She made spontaneous weekend trips to wine country. I made detailed itineraries. She bought expensive things on impulse. I researched purchases for weeks. In her grand gesture of freedom, she'd forgotten the fundamental difference between us that had somehow worked for 6 years until it didn't. She makes scenes, I make plans. My phone was in my hand before I'd consciously decided to pick it up. My first call was not to her mother, who had always treated me with polite suspicion, or her best friend Carly, who had never understood what Rebecca saw in someone so methodical. It wasn't to any of our mutual acquaintances from the engineering firm where I worked or the marketing company where she did. It was to a man named James Crawford, the most ruthless divorce attorney I could find on short notice with a 5-star Google rating and a website that spoke in the language of asset protection and strategic advantage. He specialized in complex asset division and charged $350 an hour, which seemed appropriate for the complexity of untangling a life shared for 6 years. His receptionist, speaking in the crisp tones of someone who had fielded these calls before, informed me that he could see me Monday morning at 9. I booked the appointment without hesitation, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. My second call was to my bank. I explained that my debit card had been compromised, a small lie that tasted metallic in my mouth, but felt necessary for survival. They immediately put a temporary freeze on our joint checking and savings accounts, $28,000 we'd built together through careful budgeting and shared sacrifice, pending my in-person visit to sort it out. The customer service representative was sympathetic and efficient, walking me through the steps with a practiced ease. I had a separate personal account Rebecca didn't know about. My emergency fund that I'd built up over 3 years of quietly setting aside money from overtime and small bonuses. It wasn't much, $12,000 that represented 3 months of living expenses, but it was enough to weather whatever storm was coming. Every responsible financial blog had recommended an emergency fund, though I'd never imagined I'd need it for this particular emergency. My third action was to go to our shared closet, a walk-in space we'd organized together with matching hangers and labeled shelves. Her side was half empty, a careful selection that told its own story. She'd taken her favorite things, the expensive pieces that made her feel confident and beautiful, but she'd left behind the dress she wore on our first date, a simple blue sundress that had made my heart stutter when I saw her in it. All the framed photos of us from her nightstand were still there, gathering dust in the late afternoon light, streaming through the bedroom window. More telling, she'd left her muddy running shoes right in the middle of the new Persian rug I'd bought for her birthday just 2 months ago. A thoughtless final act of disrespect that somehow hurt more than the note itself. It was such a small thing, but it crystallized everything. The assumption that someone else would clean up after her, that her freedom came at the cost of my order. I had 2 weeks of vacation time approved for a solo hiking trip to the Sierra Nevada mountains, something I'd been planning for months. Rebecca had called it boring and antisocial when I'd mentioned it, preferring the idea of beach resorts and city breaks. She'd refused to join me, claiming she couldn't understand the appeal of walking around in the dirt for fun. Now I realized it might be exactly what I needed. I packed a bag methodically, choosing practical clothes and sturdy boots, and placed her note in the top drawer of my desk next to my passport and important documents. I took one last look around the house, noting how the silence no longer felt like a void waiting to be filled with her voice and laughter, but like an opportunity for something new to grow. Then I walked out, locked the front door with a satisfying click, and went on my vacation. I didn't look for her. She had asked for freedom with the casual entitlement of someone who assumed it would be granted without consequence. I was giving it to her, with footnotes and legal counsel. The drive to the mountains took 4 hours through landscapes that gradually shifted from suburban sprawl to rolling hills to the dramatic granite faces of the Sierra Nevada. I stopped only for gas and coffee, my mind surprisingly clear despite everything. The radio played songs from our early dating years, but instead of triggering nostalgia, they felt like artifacts from someone else's life. The mountain air was clean and sharp, cutting through the fog in my mind like a blade through silk. For 5 days, I hiked until my legs ached and my lungs burned, pushing myself up trails that wound through ancient forests and across granite ridges that seemed to scrape the belly of the sky. The physical exhaustion was a welcome distraction from the emotional turmoil churning beneath the surface. I didn't check my phone much during those first 3 days. When I did, there were messages waiting, a progression that told its own story. First came the frantic texts from her friends, people who had always seemed to view our marriage from the outside with barely concealed judgment. "Hey, Rebecca is trying to reach you. She's really worried. Can you call her, please? She says there's been a misunderstanding." "Austin, seriously, what's going on?" Then came Rebecca's messages, a string of increasingly panicked communications that evolved in real time as the reality of her situation began to crystallize. They started indignant. "Are you seriously ignoring me? This is childish." Then confused. "Why isn't my card working? The bank says there's a hold." Then desperate. "Austin, please, I need to talk to you. This isn't what I meant." I read them sitting on a granite outcrop at 8,000 feet. The valley spread below me like a detailed map of a world I was no longer part of. I felt something flicker in my chest. Not guilt exactly, but a sad confirmation of what I'd suspected for months. Rebecca had expected me to be waiting when she decided to return from her adventure in freedom. She had put our marriage on pause, assuming I would dutifully hold my position until she was ready to resume playing house. On the 3rd day, climbing to a ridge that promised views of the distant peaks, I had a moment of clarity that cut through the thin air like lightning. I realized I'd been apologizing for who I was for years. The methodical, careful engineer who planned vacations 6 months ahead and kept detailed spreadsheets for our budget had been treated like a character flaw to be managed rather than a strength to be valued. Rebecca had made me feel like my stability was somehow insufficient, my predictability a burden rather than a foundation. But here, with nothing but granite and sky and the sound of my own breathing, I remembered who I was before I became half of a couple that never quite fit together properly. I was the guy who could navigate by stars, who could build a fire in the rain, who could solve complex problems with patience and logic. I was someone who kept his word, paid his bills on time, and showed up when he said he would. These weren't flaws to be corrected. They were qualities to be proud of. The revelation came with a strange sense of relief, as if I'd been holding my breath for years and could finally exhale. I sat on that ridge until sunset painted the mountains gold and purple, feeling more like myself than I had since before I'd met Rebecca. I drove back Monday morning, stopping at a truck stop just outside the city to shower and change into the suit I'd packed with the same methodical care I brought to everything else. The gray wool was perfectly pressed. My tie knotted with military precision. I felt more clear-headed than I had in years, as if the mountain air had blown away cobwebs I hadn't even realized were there. When I pulled up to James Crawford's law office, a discreet modern building in a quiet part of town where serious money went to solve serious problems, I saw her immediately. Rebecca was sitting on the low brick wall that bordered the manicured landscaping, her head in her hands in a posture of defeat that would have broken my heart just a week ago. She was wearing the same clothes she'd had on in her last Instagram post from 3 days ago, a post I'd discovered with morbid curiosity while scrolling through social media on the second night of my trip. The caption had read, "Finally free," with a champagne glass emoji and a photo of her clinking cocktails with an unseen companion whose masculine hand was just visible at the edge of the frame. The chic freedom seeker from that carefully curated photo was gone, replaced by someone who looked like she'd been sleeping in her car. Today she looked frayed and desperate. Her usually perfect hair was a mess. Her carefully applied makeup had been cried off, and there were tear tracks cutting through what remained of her foundation like channels carved by flash floods. The designer jeans that had looked so effortlessly casual in her social media post were wrinkled and coffee-stained. She saw my car and shot to her feet with the jerky movements of someone running on adrenaline and caffeine. "Austin!" she called out, her voice carrying a note of relief mixed with barely controlled hysteria. I got out of the car and looked at her without saying a word. The silence stretched between us like a chasm, and I could see her struggling to read my expression, searching for some sign of the man who would have rushed to comfort her distress just a week ago. "Austin, what the hell is going on?" she demanded, her voice cracking with the strain of trying to maintain some semblance of control. "My card was declined at a hotel yesterday. It was so humiliating. I was standing in the lobby with my luggage while they ran it 3 times. And the joint savings, it's frozen. I tried to call the bank and they said you reported a security breach. What is that supposed to mean?" I adjusted my tie with deliberate precision, a gesture that had always annoyed her during our arguments. "It's exactly what it sounds like, Rebecca. Our financial security has been breached." Her face cycled through expressions like a slot machine: confusion, anger, disbelief, and finally a hardening resolve that I recognized from years of watching her gear up for battle. "That's not funny. This is our money. Money we saved together. I needed that money I had plans." "I'm sure you did," I said, my voice level and emotionless. I started walking toward the office door, my footsteps echoing off the polished concrete of the walkway. She scurried to keep up, her tone shifting from anger to the kind of desperate pleading that might have worked on the old Austin. "Okay, look, maybe I should have talked to you first," she said, grabbing my arm with fingers that felt like talons through the fabric of my suit. I stopped and looked down at her hand until she let go, a small victory that felt larger than it should have. But I was suffocating, Austin. I felt like I was disappearing into us, into this life we built that felt more like yours than mine. I needed space, a break. That's all this was, a little break to clear my head and figure out what I wanted. And I come back to find you've hired a lawyer? She paused, scanning my face for some crack in the armor, some sign of the man who used to melt when she cried. I saw the email confirmation on the tablet. A divorce lawyer, Austin. Are you completely insane? We don't divorce over a misunderstanding. We talk, we go to therapy, we work things out like adults. This was the moment that crystallized everything with perfect, brutal clarity. She hadn't left me. She had just put me on pause, expecting me to wait patiently in the wings like a faithful dog until she decided she was done with her grand adventure in self-discovery. The sheer, blinding entitlement of it was almost impressive in its completeness. "You left a note, Rebecca," I said, my voice dangerously soft. It said, "Don't look for me. I need freedom." It didn't say, "I'll be back on Monday. Please have the accounts liquid and my emotional availability on standby." You wanted freedom. I'm just formalizing the arrangement. "Formalizing it?" she shrieked, fresh tears starting to flow like a dam had burst. "You can't just divorce me. We have 6 years together. 6 years. We have to talk about this. We have to try. You don't just blow up our entire life because I needed some time to think." "You detonated the bomb, Rebecca," I replied, turning my back to her with a finality that felt like closing a book I'd been reading for far too long. "I'm just picking through the rubble to see what's salvageable." I opened the heavy glass door to the law firm, feeling the cool rush of air-conditioned air against my face. The last thing I heard as it swished shut behind me was her sobbing my name, a question laced with dawning, horrified understanding. James Crawford's office was exactly what I'd expected. Floor-to-ceiling law books, a massive mahogany desk, and the kind of leather chairs that whispered of serious money-changing hands. Crawford himself was a compact man in his 50s with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. He listened to my story with the detached professionalism of a surgeon planning an operation. "Abandonment," he said when I finished, making notes on a legal pad with a fountain pen that probably cost more than most people's monthly car payment. "Clear documentation of intent to dissolve the marital relationship. The note is excellent evidence. The Instagram posts will be helpful. We'll need to establish timeline and gather financial records." 3 days later, a week of blessed silence was broken by a phone call from an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail, a habit I'd developed since returning from the mountains. The message was from a man with a smooth, confident voice, the kind of voice used to getting its way through charm rather than merit. "Austin, this is Jared Sterling. Listen, I think we got off on the wrong foot here. Rebecca is obviously very upset, and frankly, you're not being rational about this whole situation. Why don't you and I have a man-to-man chat and figure this out like reasonable people? Give me a call. Jared." I knew the name intimately now, had been hearing it for months in contexts that suddenly made perfect sense. He was a senior manager from Rebecca's marketing department, the one she'd laughed with a little too long at the company Christmas party, the one whose name had started popping up in late-night texts that she'd quickly minimized when I entered the room. The one whose Q4 bonus was supposedly tied to a major campaign launch that had kept him working late with increasing frequency. I didn't call him back. Instead, I forwarded the voicemail audio file to James Crawford with the subject line, "Evidence, Third-Party Interference," and went back to my evening routine of cooking dinner for one and reading books that Rebecca had always dismissed as boring. The next evening, they appeared at my door like carolers from hell. I saw them through the peephole, Rebecca standing slightly behind Jared, who had his hand possessively on her lower back in a gesture of ownership that made my stomach turn. He looked exactly as I'd pictured from Rebecca's descriptions. Expensive. Haircut that screamed, "I spend more on grooming than most people spend on food." A smug expression that suggested the world owed him something, and a jacket that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. He rang the doorbell with a sharp, impatient jab, the kind of aggressive move that probably worked well in conference rooms full of intimidated subordinates. I opened the door a few inches, leaving the security chain on, a precaution that felt both necessary and slightly ridiculous. "Yes?" Jared's smile was pure condescension distilled into facial expression form. "Austin, good to finally meet you. We need to talk man to man." "I'm talking to my lawyer," I said, noting how his smile flickered at the mention of legal representation. "You should have Rebecca talk to hers." "Now see, that's exactly the kind of attitude that's making this whole situation so much more difficult than it needs to be," he said, trying to lean into the doorway with the casual aggression of someone used to physical intimidation working in his favor. The security chain held firm. "Rebecca is willing to be reasonable here. She's willing to come home, let you calm down, and we can all sort this out like adults." "We?" I asked, looking past him at Rebecca, who seemed to be trying to disappear into his shadow. "There is no we in this equation, Jared. There's you, and there's me, and there's a woman who made her choice very clear in writing." Rebecca finally spoke, her voice thin and shaky. "Austin, please. He's just trying to help. This has all been a huge misunderstanding. I never meant for things to go this far. Just let me in so I can get some of my things and we can talk properly." "Your things will be handled through our respective attorneys," I said, my voice flat and emotionless. Then I looked her directly in the eye, noting how she flinched under the scrutiny. "Besides, the key you left wouldn't have worked anyway." Her brow furrowed in genuine confusion, the first honest emotion I'd seen from her since this whole nightmare began. "What are you talking about?" "The locks were changed the morning I left for my trip," I said, watching her face process this information. "You vacated the property by your own written statement. You have no legal right to be here." Jared scoffed, his practiced charm curdling into the kind of naked aggression that probably served him well in corporate power plays, but felt clumsy and desperate in this context. Don't be an ass about this, Austin. This is her home, too. We just need to get her passport and some clothes, and then we'll be out of your hair. Then her lawyer can send my lawyer a formal request with a proposed timeline, I said, already beginning to close the door. Jared's hand shot out, pushing against the door with enough force to make the chain rattle against the frame. You're going to regret this power trip, buddy. I can make things very difficult for you if you want to play hardball. The threat hung in the air between us like smoke from a discharged weapon. It was clumsy, stupid, and the best gift he could have given me. I looked him dead in the eye, noting how his confidence wavered under direct scrutiny. Is that a threat, Jared? He faltered for just a second, long enough for me to see the corporate middle manager beneath the alpha male performance. It's advice, man. Just trying to help you see reason. I'll add it to the file, I said, and closed the door with a soft click that somehow felt more final than slamming it would have. I heard them muttering outside for several minutes, their voices rising and falling in what sounded like an argument. Eventually, their footsteps retreated, car doors slammed, and silence returned to my house like a tide washing clean sand. That night, unable to sleep, I made a decision that would change everything. I powered up our old shared desktop computer, a relic from our early marriage that we'd kept for shared documents and photos. I'd never had a reason to be suspicious before, or maybe I'd chosen not to see what was right in front of me. It didn't take long. Rebecca had always been careless with digital security, using the same password for everything, and never bothering to clear browser histories or delete messages. What I found was a treasure trove of evidence that painted our marriage in colors I'd never seen before. Hotel bookings dating back 4 months, restaurant reservations at places I'd never been to, charged to credit cards I hadn't authorized. But most damning of all was a private message thread between Rebecca and Jared that read like a script for betrayal. It was all there, the deception, the planning, the casual cruelty that took my breath away. God, he's so predictable, one message read. Plans everything to death. Zero spontaneity. Another, can't wait to get out of this suffocating suburban nightmare. And the worst, he'll probably just sit there and accept it. That's what he does, accepts things. The final message from her, sent the morning she left, was like a knife between my ribs. Note is on the counter, freedom awaits, see you at the hotel in an hour. This is going to be so much easier than I thought. I methodically took screenshots of everything, saving them to a thumb drive I labeled simply evidence. I emailed copies to James Crawford with timestamps and context. The grief was still there, that cold stone in my gut, but now it had a hard, sharp edge. It was transforming into something else entirely. Not revenge exactly, but a crystalline clarity about what needed to happen next. The following month was a master class in the power of careful planning versus emotional chaos. I didn't have to be a mastermind. I just had to be organized, methodical, and honest about what had actually happened. First came the house situation. We'd been renting for 3 years with an option to buy that I'd been carefully saving toward. When the landlord called about lease renewal, I explained the situation with clinical precision. Rebecca had permanently vacated the premises as evidenced by her written note. I had documentation proving abandonment. I would like to renew the lease in my name only and exercise the purchase option. He was a practical man who valued stability over drama. Within a week, I had a new lease and purchase agreement in my name alone. Rebecca's panicked phone call came 2 days later. The landlord says I'm not on the lease anymore. He said if I try to enter the property, he'll call the police. You can't do this, Austin. I've lived there for 3 years. You abandoned the lease, Rebecca, I said, using the precise legal language James had coached me to use. My attorney has documentation proving your voluntary departure from the marital residence. The social fallout was swift and decisive. I didn't need to badmouth Rebecca to our mutual friends and acquaintances. Her behavior spoke loudly enough on its own. She and Jared had gone public with their relationship almost immediately, posting photos from expensive restaurants and weekend getaways that looked desperate rather than romantic. Meanwhile, word of her dramatic exit and my methodical response had spread through both our professional circles. Our mutual friend Brooke called me with updates that felt like battlefield reports. It's all anyone at their office talks about, she told me over coffee. The atmosphere is toxic. Apparently HR is involved now because of the workplace relationship policy. And Jared's wife, did you know he was married? She's filed for divorce too. His Q4 bonus is probably gone, and there's talk about restructuring his department. It turned out Rebecca had been as careless with vetting her escape plan as she had been with covering her tracks. Jared was indeed married, with 2 young children and a mortgage that consumed most of his supposedly impressive salary. His assets were tied up in his own marital home, his wife had hired her own ruthless attorney, and his workplace affair was now a matter of corporate record. The financial pressure on them became apparent quickly. Without access to our joint accounts, Rebecca was entirely dependent on Jared's increasingly precarious income. The expensive hotels and dinners stopped appearing on social media, replaced by a suspicious silence that spoke volumes. The ultimate revelation of their desperation came in the form of a late-night voicemail from Rebecca that I almost deleted without listening to. It was a rambling, tearful monologue about a vacation we'd taken to Napa Valley 3 years ago, full of, "Remember how happy we were," and "I don't know how we got here." It ended with a request that crystallized everything. Anyway, I know things are weird right now, but I really need my half of the security deposit from the landlord. It's just sitting there, and I have some unexpected expenses. Can you just send it to me? The audacity was breathtaking. Even in her desperation, she still viewed our shared assets as her personal emergency fund. 8 months after I found that note, it was over. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday morning that felt no different from any other until James Crawford called to tell me it was done. It wasn't a dramatic courtroom scene with gavels and tears. It was a series of signatures on documents that dissolved 6 years of shared history into a legal settlement. James had earned every penny of his $8,500 fee. He presented our case with the cold precision of a surgeon, documenting Rebecca's premeditated infidelity, her abandonment of the marital home, and Jared's clumsy attempts at intimidation. The final settlement reflected the reality of fault-based divorce. Rebecca walked away with her personal belongings, the car her parents had bought her, and $10,000 from our joint savings. I kept $18,000 from our shared accounts, the house, and my carefully preserved $45,000 down payment that would make homeownership a reality rather than a dream. Last month, sitting across from my former landlord-turned-seller, I signed the purchase papers that made the house officially mine. It felt like closing one chapter and beginning another. The most satisfying moment came unexpectedly 3 weeks later. I was reading in my newly painted kitchen when my phone buzzed with a Spotify notification. "Your password has been changed." I realized Rebecca had still been using our family plan, one last thread connecting us that I'd forgotten to cut. I logged in, removed her profile, and changed the password again. It felt like turning the final lock on a door I no longer needed to keep open. I don't hate Rebecca. Hate requires too much energy, too much ongoing investment in someone else's story. What I feel now is the cool indifference of a completely resolved issue. The house feels like home now, my home. I'm dating again, carefully and with clear boundaries learned through experience. Sometimes I think about that man who stood in a silent kitchen 8 months ago, reading a note that changed everything. His pain was real, but it became the foundation for something better. Rebecca and Jared will probably spend years blaming me for their problems, but they created their own consequences. I simply got out of the way and let justice serve itself.